Hello, I'm Ryan Bijan, and I'd like to welcome you to the inaugural episode of the BACKSEAT FILMMAKER Podcast. We let the real filmmakers do all the work while we sit in the back and bitch about it. This first season, titled Unusual Suspect, the life and films of Bryan Singer, is not meant to glamorize or condemn, but rather ask, is it possible to separate the art from the artist? And is it just to cancel anyone if they've never been proven guilty in the eyes of the law? We hope to explore the criminal accusations and media speculation, as well as evaluate the artistic value of the director's actual work. This episode was researched and co-produced by Quade, music by Spencer Wallace. I am sitting here with
Quade. I am a big fan of Bryan Singer. Yeah, that's what I'm doing here.
Don't sell yourself short. Connor is actually a very talented writer and a scholar on film, and we're both very big fans of the director, producer, filmmaker, Bryan Singer, and that's why we're here today.
Yeah, we're here to discuss the life, art, and alleged crimes of one Bryan Singer, and essentially just get to the bottom of all the allegations while discussing his art in greater detail than has been done before, I guess. Right,
Connor. And what allegations are these? I mean, Bryan Singer in the past has been accused of making some really good movies.
Yeah. There's a lot of allegations revolving around his conduct towards underage men or men of barely consenting age, be it him or involving his friends, close friends, or business associates that we'll also get into as well. But for today, for this first episode, we're gonna go more into the early stuff about Bryan and end with some allegations. But right now, we're just gonna go more towards the beginning of his career and talk about his early work.
All right. Well, if you are actually tuning in and listening to this podcast, you probably already are familiar with Bryan's work. But as a little bit of a refresher, Bryan Singer's career kind of exploded onto the scene in the mid-90s with the film The Usual Suspects. From there, he went on to do the original X-Men to great critical and commercial acclaim, which in a lot of ways
Change film is what it did.
You can give it credit, or you can blame X-Men for sort of the rise of the popular comic book film in cinema, which, of course, it's dominating movie screens. Well, pre-COVID it was, with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Of course, we would not have that. We would not have the Christopher Nolan Dark Knight trilogy.
Nope.
We would not have Sam Raimi's Spider-Man had it not been for the success of Bryan Singer's X-Men in 2000. From there, he went on to do such other great works as...
He did X2, which is great, and my personal favorite film by him, which is Superman Returns, which came out in 2006, and we're going to have a whole episode over that. So for all you Returns nuts out there like me, it's coming. You just got to bear with us, I promise.
Yeah, and if you are a comic book superhero fan, he is one of the few mainstream commercial filmmakers to go between worlds. He's conquered the Marvel and the DC universes and sort of rebooted two of their most popular properties for the big screen. After Superman Returns, he did Valkyrie, starring Tom Cruise, which was his World War II action thriller. And from Valkyrie, he went on to do
the critically acclaimed film Jack the Giant Slayer, starring Nicholas Hoult. That came out in 2013, about 5 years after Valkyrie. He was already in the midst of doing pre-production on X-Men Days of Future Past and X-Men First Class, but he got bogged down in the post-production of Jack.
It's interesting to talk about that. After kickstarting the comic book franchise craze in the early 2000s, he was able to return to 20th Century Fox's X-Men franchise with X-Men Days of Future Past, which in 2014, which I would say is a pretty triumphant return.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely could be considered the best X-Men film, in my opinion. I mean, I think you can make the argument for that, for sure. Even, compared with Logan and X2, I think you could still say Days of Future Past, there's still a lot of room to say it's the best one, for sure.
Right, and it's definitely worth noting that in the years between X-Men 2 and Days of Future Past, you had the monumental success of Iron Man, Captain America, the First Avenger, the original Avengers directed by Joss Whedon, which was like a tremendous billion-dollar grossing film.
Yeah.
So it is kind of interesting having someone as passionate and interested in the material as Bryan Singer being able to return to the genre that he helped jumpstart, look at it through the lens of these other immensely successful successors, and getting to revisit that world in the post-Avengers world.
Yeah, Days of Future Past, studio-wise, it definitely, and we'll talk about more of this in the episode about it, but definitely seemed like an Avengers cash grab with all of the whole cast is coming back or whatever, but when you bring back Bryan Singer, it just elevates it to a level of artistry that, frankly, you don't see in many movies that cost that much. And I think that he really didn't miss a beat, honestly. He didn't miss a beat at all. And he did the entire outline and plot for First Class as well. He just didn't direct it, but he wrote that whole movie.
So great stuff. I mean, you have X-Men First Class, you have X-Men Days of Future Past, the first two in the rebooted trilogy, which, again, like the original X-Men, were very critically and commercially successful. In 2016, you did have his final entry in the X-Men saga.
Underrated.
X-Men Apocalypse, which I know, Connor, we're both very big fans of the film.
Yes. Yes, it's a definite yes.
Yeah, the Marvel Cinematic Universe fan base, maybe not so much. But then you have X-Men Apocalypse would lead into what we both kind of feel is Bryan Singer's crowning achievement as almost an autobiographical piece. 2018's Bohemian Rhapsody.
Yeah, and this is why I think, the way I have it like structured for the pod is like the last episode is going to be about Bohemian Rhapsody, and that's going to be after we go over pretty much every single article on the internet about Bryan's life. And we're not separating the artist's life from the artist's work here. If anything, Bohemian Rhapsody is like a culmination of those two things coming together. So when we talk about Bohemian Rhapsody, I don't know much about Queen, but I do know everything in the world about Bryan Singer's life. So,
and I know a little bit about Queen.
Yeah, Bijan's a big fan of Queen. So, but like when I watch Bohemian Rhapsody, it's like the movie is clearly all about Bryan, his talent, his failings, and everything in between. So, it's a really fascinating movie to watch if you go on this journey with us kind of through Bryan's life, because they really are. Freddie and Bryan are much more similar than you might think just from looking at them, but a lot of good comparisons there.
Right. So, Connor, let me ask you, what was your first introduction to the work of Bryan Singer, whether or not you were aware of who he was as a director, but just as a work, what was the first film to make that impact?
Yeah, I mean, I had X-1 and X-2 on VHS, and I love those movies, but I didn't really know who Bryan Singer was until I saw Superman Returns in theaters in 2006. And I remember seeing that in theaters and being just blown away by how emotionally powerful and draining and devastating that movie is. For like a tentpole summer movie, I was just moved by the emotions and just the beauty of the relationships and how it was filmed. And and then I got it on DVD, and it had all the special features, so I watched Bryan Singer's production diary. So that's how I kind of knew who Bryan was. Before then, I loved X1 and X2, but I didn't really know anything about Bryan or John Ottman or, like, his team or anything. But by the time Superman Returns rolled around, I was 14 when that came out. So at that point, I was like, man, this guy is really onto something special. But yeah, I'd say that's how I first became aware of who Bryan was. I don't know. What about you?
I think when X-Men 1 came out, I remember seeing it in theaters. I was 9 years old that summer, and I was already a huge fan of the franchise from the animated series, the 1992 animated series, which would air on Fox Kids.
Classic. Growing
up. And that was my sort of foray into that universe, into the Marvel universe, really, because back in the 90s, no one gave a shit about the Avengers. What, Thor? Are you kidding me?
D-listers, all of them.
Yeah, Iron Man, Thor, maybe. Oh, I like playing as Captain America in Marvel vs. Capcom.
Yeah. But Hulk was way cooler, though.
But yeah, in the 90s, Marvel was two franchises. It was Spider-Man and X-Men, and that's all that really mattered. So even as a 9-year-old kid, I was going into that original X-Men film with huge expectations. And people need to remember, like, back then, you had the Tim Burton, Joel Schumacher Batman franchise. You had a couple of outliers like, Steel, starring Shaquille O'Neal.
Yeah.
Blade, which of course is a very influential film, but it was never sold or marketed as a superhero film.
And it was rated R, not for kids.
Right. And to me, Blade is more of a vampire action thriller in the vein of like From Dusk Till Dawn.
Yeah, I can see that.
Or John Carpenter's Vampires, because that's what they sold it as.
Definitely the Carpenter's Vampires thing, for sure. I could see that.
Right. But X-Men was the first kind of mainstream, bigger budget film, I think, really since, I don't know, Batman Returns, which I think took the material very seriously. And it wasn't concerned with, there was a huge marketing push. I remember there were action figures, there were notebooks, comics, tie-in video games. But it wasn't, those were a byproduct of the movie itself. It wasn't the movie trying to hawk the merchandise. But yeah, X-Men 1 I think had a huge impact. As a fan, I was satisfied. Because even as a 9-year-old, I realized it's not going to be a straight one-for-one adaptation. You still have to reimagine it and make it work as a film and something that could exist in the real world.
Yeah.
Which Bryan, to his credit, he didn't treat it like a spandex comic book film. He treated it as it's a science fiction movie.
Just so influential. We're still living in that world. I know that, MCU, they're getting, a little more comic booky and out there.
Yeah.
But, most of them, until, Avengers 2, still took place, on Earth in the real world and not, and, superheroes being called by their first names and stuff like that. You know what I mean? That idea of the superheroes in X-Men just being people called Logan and not Wolverine in a yellow suit. I think people don't understand how radical that was. And how really hated it was by a lot of people. There are a lot of fans really upset by that shit.
Yeah, well, I remember as a kid, there's the famous line in the film pertaining to the X-Men wearing their tactical black leather motorcycle uniforms. What would you prefer, yellow spandex? And as a kid, I thought it was funny, but I didn't realize people took that really seriously.
Yeah, man. Well, and also Bryan, we'll get into this, but didn't come from that background. He came from a very different kind of background. So he was fine with changing the costumes. It was not sacrilege to him the way it would be to a more, I guess, slavish comic book adapter.
Right, but I was just going to say real quick to make a long story short. So X-Men was the first film that had a big impact on me in that way, but I was still 9 years old. But I think by the time X2 came out, I was 12, 13 years old when I saw it in theaters. By then I was aware, directed by Bryan Singer. I had a much more deeper fascination with how the sausage was made, who was behind the camera, who's calling the shots.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Speaking of sausage, the allegations that we're going to go over, this episode we're not going to go over too many because I want to ease everybody into, because they're pretty dark and horrific, a lot of them, so I don't want to just
You just don't want to stick it in. You want to ease it in.
I gotta ease it in.
You gotta lube it up a little.
Yeah, you gotta rev the engine, But before we start getting into the meat of this episode, I just want to say
the meat.
The meat, yeah. I want to say just what my personal mission is with this podcast, why I'm doing this, and why I have picked Bryan Singer as my hill to die on, essentially, in terms of loving film. This was all a big reaction because, like we just said, I grew up with Bryan's films. My co-host grew up with his films. They've affected us in very deep, profoundly life-changing ways. Especially for me, like I said, Superman Returns.
Yeah.
So, when all the allegations started coming out in 2014 and he's been systematically canceled and destroyed in the press for the past 4 years with all these allegations, which none of them have been proven to be true, by the way. So don't sue us, Bryan Singer. Just saying. They're all allegations. But I think that my biggest issue with it is that they started going after the man, and then they started going after the art and saying that not only was Bryan Singer a sick pedophile, he also just sucked at making movies, and all of his movies are actually bad. And if any of them are good, it's everyone else's fault. It's all the other people he worked with that made the movie good because Bryan had nothing to do with it. And they're just basically trying to delete him from having any positive impact on a film at all. They'll print all the stories about how he ruined a movie, but then they'll say anything good in it is everyone else's fault. And that's where I kind of draw the line. At some point, we got to save the art.
So ultimately, you want to give credit where credit is due.
Well, I do, but also I don't think anyone's really gone into Bryan's films as actual art, being looked at as an artistic work, because I think they are so popular that it's easy to to like kind of brush them off.
Yeah, I mean, these are big commercial films. Even something like Valkyrie with Tom Cruise or Jack this Giant Slayer. These were meant to be tentpole blockbuster films. You want to make money. You want to sell toys, especially with the X-Men Marvel universe. So I think it is very easy to dismiss that and say, oh, he's just a hack. He's a director for hire for the studio. But
I've heard that, yeah.
Right, but as you know, as we're going to go over today, his films do have a very distinctive visual and oral language that does set them apart. And I don't think anyone is going to get X-Men Days of Future Past confused with Guardians of the Galaxy or Iron Man 3. You know, there is definitely a distinctive
voice. Which all came out
there.
like the same year,
right?
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
yeah. Think of it this way: whenever someone tries to whenever someone's like, "Oh, Bryan Singer," you know, why the fuck are you talking about him? I'm like, think of it this way: how does Iron Man 3 open? It opens with "I'm Blue, Dabba Dee Dabba Die" by Eiffel 65 over the Marvel logo, just to pander to the millennial idiots who are seeing it in theaters. Like me, I saw that and I was like, "Oh, this is funny, yay!" How does X-Men? How does Days of Future Past start? You fade in to a dystopian future over a concentration camp full of mutants with spaceships flying over in the middle of the night. You just hear Patrick Stewart whisper, "The future." And I'm just like, yeah, we're in the hands of a master. That's the difference. That's the difference between a Bryan Singer movie and pretty much any other movie that's made for that amount of money.
Right, and I'm sure we're going to go into more detail in a later episode. But it's crazy that, like, you bring that up now, and the genre has been around long enough that you can experiment, you can try different things and go into different directions. Of course, there you have the post-apocalyptic James Cameron version of a concentration camp, but even that is a callback to the even more shocking opening of X-Men 1. You know, 20 years ago, nobody was doing that, and you literally open your big tentpole, a McDonald's action figure selling film in was it Dachau and what was it, or Auschwitz? Yeah, it's like Jesus Christ.
I mean, opening up your X-Men movie with a scene in concentration camps doesn't get ballsier than that, okay?
Yeah, dude, Poland, 1944.
Like, it's happening now, you know? And First Class literally just reshoots that scene because it's just so good. You don't need to improve it. It's just the same scene.
Yeah, now let's dig deep a little bit. So who is Bryan Singer? What was his early life like?
Bryan was adopted. He was adopted by a family in New Jersey. He was born Jewish, but was adopted by a family in New Jersey, so he grew up in a Catholic neighborhood. So him always feeling like the outsider and hiding in plain sight and blending in but being different, those are all things that are kind of from his childhood that translate into his films, all of his films. So when he grew up in New Jersey, that's when he kind of met Ethan Hawke and a couple other people who were, you know, kind of making it into films. And then he went to NYU for a year and then transferred to USC, but they wouldn't let him into the production for film. They put him in critical studies instead, which he said greatly benefited him as a filmmaker because he got to watch a lot of good movies. So anybody who wants to make movies, watch a lot more movies before you start making movies, because you definitely need to see more of them. I promise you that. So then he graduated from USC, and then he comes out with a short film in 91, and then a feature length called Public Access in 93, which wins the Grand Jury Prize at the Sundance Film Festival. And pretty much after that, I think he was like 25 or 26 when he won the Grand Jury Prize there, and after that he was off to the races to make The Usual Suspects. So that's kind of the early Bryan in a nutshell. I don't think we need to go into too much more about like his upbringing, except for like being adopted, being Jewish. He's also gay, growing up in like the 80s and 90s, you know. A lot of that informs his art.
Yeah, and you mentioned The Usual Suspects, his first sort of big commercial Hollywood film. It's a fascinating film, and that's a story, I mean, because the movie was so successful that even growing up, I knew it through osmosis. Like, you're already aware of the twists and the turns kind of going into the film.
The shot of his foot going straight at the end, you know what I mean? Like, it's just ingrained in your head.
Right, it's an important part of pop culture. And then that cast, you have Kevin Spacey, Gabriel Byrne, Benicio del Toro. I mean, Giancarlo Esposito, Chaz Palminteri. Like, I mean, you can't... I mean, it's hard to compete with that. So even in his first film, like
Pete Postlewaite,
yeah. Like even in that early film, you can't. I mean, you can see Bryan's strength as an ensemble storyteller
Totally,
and
totally.
balancing those out. But we actually, Connor and I rewatched it in its entirety recently, and it's so fascinating. You watch it. It is a very, it's an eager film in the sense that Bryan Singer, composer, editor John Ottman, Thomas Newton Siegel, this was their big break. You can tell they wanted to make the best movie they could. There's a lot of energy in that film, from the camera movements, from the edits, the cuts, I mean, just it's a very advanced film. When Bryan was like, what? How old was he? 28, 29?
27, 20. I think he was 28 when he shot it, I think.
When he shot it.
I think he was 29 when it came out.
Yeah, and you can tell, like, even from that first big break, this is a man who understands the language of film and storytelling and how to frame a compelling shot.
Yeah.
And like the script itself, there's a lot going on. I admit I'll probably have to watch it a few more times just to pick up on everything. But it's one of those movies, it doesn't even matter if you know what's going on in the film. It's still very entertaining and very engaging.
Yeah. The Usual Suspects, to me, it's my favorite film by Bryan besides Superman Returns.
Really?
Just because of the stuff you said. It's such a hungry film. Everybody, like Newton Thomas Siegel as doing the cinematography, John Ottman, who edited and scored it, and Bryan producing and directing it, and McQuarrie writing it. Like, that team of people, Siegel, Ottman, and Singer, that team is going to be making films with him the next 20 years. So it's kind of interesting to see just how well they come together just in their first movie together. And, like, how everything just seemed to work instantly. And The Usual Suspects, to me, it's like, it's a perfect engine of a film. Because there's nothing really wrong with it, except for, like, you could just not liking it, you know? Like, it's structured well, the acting's good, the writing is good, the pacing is good, everything about the movie is well done. And
well, you can't argue, and then, you know, once you get to the end, you understand that it is like it's a deliberate choice. There are times in the film where the narrative seems a little bit muddled, but then you realize, like, okay, it is an unreliable narrator. This is all by design.
yeah, and also, like you said, it's just so goddamn entertaining that you don't really even need to, like, I mean, you can follow it, I guess, but it's more of just, like, experiencing the film and just being inside Bryan's crazy mind for 2 hours. Like, just, like, the way he directs his ensemble is staggering, in my opinion, and it really sets the table for X-Men, for sure.
Absolutely. But it's so fascinating that even you go back and watch The Usual Suspects, this is the film that put these men on the map. It is a very macho, ballsy, act, like, it's a man's movie. It's a film for guys, ultimately.
Yes.
It's a very, very masculine, testosterone-driven film. And in a lot of ways, even stylistically, the way the movie's shot and put together, it feels very atypical when you put it next to the films that would come soon afterwards, I would say.
Yeah, I think with Usual Suspects, I think there's one woman in it. Like, the whole movie.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
one woman, at least one woman who talks, and she's like a love interest of Gabriel Byrne. And if you're the one person in the world who hasn't seen Usual Suspects, I'm not going to summarize it here because it's way too hard to summarize. Just go out and watch it. But to me, like, what's so amazing about watching Usual Suspects is that it is super manly, it is super macho, but it's also about, like, you know, relationships between men being friends, how men act in friend groups, or, like, how men work with each other to achieve a goal, even though we all don't really like each other. You know what I mean? And,
But
like,
dude, homies over hoes.
yeah. I don't know. I just find The Usual Suspects fascinating because it is so, like, manly, and, you know, Bryan's on the record saying how much he was involved with the writing of it. He knew all the characters and this and that. Bryan, you know, I know he gets in a lot of trouble, and the allegations will go into this for, like, him being, you know, his love of young men and him being gay. It's a huge part of his life. But The Usual Suspects is an incredibly manly movie. There's some homoeroticism in it if you want to read it that way, but you can only really read it that way when you know about Bryan, I would say.
Right, so The Usual Suspects opened at the Sundance Film Festival and later went on to a wide release on August 16th, 1995. It was a mammoth success, grossing almost $35 million on a $6 million budget.
Jesus.
So Bryan Singer had arrived. And Connor, you mentioned around this time, this is sort of when the parties began.
Yeah, so it's pretty much after The Usual Suspects that all of the Bryan Singer stories, parties, rumors really start. Because it seems like beforehand, like there's no The Usual Suspects is the only film that Bryan Singer's ever done that I've been able to find where he was on set every single day and was not off doing other stuff. Like even on Apt Pupil, which is his second film that he did right after Usual Suspects, he was already starting to be absent from the set. We'll go into that later. But I think what's really interesting is that after The Usual Suspects grosses 6 times its budget and it just catapults Bryan Singer to the top, he starts having these massive parties at he had 2 mansions around LA. And the parties themselves, while not illegal, catered to an exclusive clientele of young twinks, as they're called.
Connor, what is a twink? Explain that to our
It's like a power bottom. No, I'm just kidding. But
are you saying they generate power?
I thought speed had something to do with it. So like the twinks would come over and like the parties, either he's hosting them and all the twinks are there. These are young men ages 18 to 20 usually. That's the window for Bryan. And his associates skew a little younger. So he would kind of pick off the of age twinks from his procurer friends who would get younger men, and it's that kind of shadow network that we're going to try to explore. But The Usual Suspects is a huge hit and everyone loves Bryan. And then, he signs on to X-Men in fall of 96. So he hasn't even made Apt Pupil yet, and he's already signed on to X-Men because Usual Suspects is such a huge hit.
Right, and I think it should be noted that the original X-Men film had been in development hell in some iteration or another since the mid-1980s.
Yeah.
I believe at one point James Cameron was in talks about doing it. The success of Tim Burton's Batman 1989 kind of prompted another iteration. So it was bouncing around for a few years before active development began with the version we would end up with in 2000. Mm-hmm. So from 1996 to 2000, what was Bryan doing in the meantime?
Well, he made Apt Pupil. Stephen King sold him the rights to it for $1 because he loved The Usual Suspects so much that he wanted Bryan Singer to make a film out of Apt Pupil. So he gets the rights for Apt Pupil in late 96, signs on to it in 97, and then shoots it in 97. And, Apt Pupil, do you want to just talk about Apt Pupil, or do you want to do more Usual Suspects first?
There's not a lot we can add to the Usual Suspects conversation because it has been talked about and written about so much in the past 25 years. But Apt Pupil was a really interesting film to me. It was a film that, again, I knew of through Reputation. Mm-hmm. The premise always seemed kind of interesting.
What is the premise? Could you tell us what the premise is?
An Apt Pupil set in 1984. Brad Renfro plays Brad Renfro is a high school student who's sort of top of his class. He's a 16-year-old senior making great grades. He excels in the history and social studies department with a particular fascination with World War II and the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And throughout the day, sort of in his daily bus ride home, he notices an elderly gentleman played by
The man.
Eric Lencher himself.
Gandalf the Grey, guys. Ian McKellen. The man's a legend.
Sir Ian McKellen.
My bad, sir.
This older gentleman played by Sir Ian McKellen, who bears a striking resemblance to a Nazi officer in Brad Renfro's World War II textbooks and documents. So where do we go from there, Connor?
So after that very interesting premise, the movie quickly takes a tumble into a little bit more plot-driven like territory. But to me, Apt Pupil, the entire premise is a little insane, where he recognizes a guy on his bus who is a Nazi war criminal, and he recognizes him from a 40-year-old photograph. I don't know. It doesn't really make any sense. But the point is that the premise is really cool, and then Brad Renfro's like, if you don't tell me what you did during the Holocaust, I'm going to tell on you, and the Israelis are going to come get you and extradite you, and you're going to go die in Jerusalem in prison. So essentially their relationship blossoms from there. There's a lot of really interesting scenes and stuff in it. But the biggest takeaway from this film is that The Usual Suspects was a man's movie, right? And then Apt Pupil is Bryan Singer, the man's movie. What does that mean? That means that there is just gratuitous shot upon gratuitous shot of Brad Renfro without a shirt on. I think, what did you say when he's like laying in his bed?
He's like a pubescent Venus de Milo, sprawled out in all of this sweating, glistening glory. He's a torso.
Yeah, he's just on like his bed, like glistening, like suffering from these Nazi delusional dreams that he has, and just like these tiny boxers just covered in sweat. And that's like in the first 10 minutes. And then it shows him playing basketball with all of his other young male, schoolmates. And once again, he has his shirt off and he's covered in sweat. And, there's a lot of scenes of Brad Renfro in bed with his shirt off, covered in sweat or somewhat moist, I guess.
There's a lot of male moistness in this film.
Yeah, so what I kind of want to say is this is the transition from Bryan being the good boy of Usual Suspects, the nice guy.
The mainstream Hollywood director of Usual Suspects. Yeah,
and to like now it's like, okay, these are just becoming Bryan's movies now. Because if you understand Bryan's proclivities and the rumors about him and Renfro, like just the two of them, it all makes a lot more sense. It's like watching Clown House by Victor Selva. It's the same thing.
Absolutely. And you know what? Let's talk about Brad Renfro a little bit. So you watch the film and you can see he's definitely the object of Bryan's gaze. Mm-hmm. G-A-Z-E.
G-A-Z-E. Yeah, get your heads out of the gutters, okay?
Right, and you can and then when you do kind of in retrospect, if you are aware of the accusations and the stories, it is uncomfortable to watch.
Yeah.
But then you realize, like, okay, Brad Renfro had a troubled path, which it should be mentioned that Brad Renfro, very tragically, committed suicide at the age of 28.
Yeah, he OD'd on heroin technically. But,
right. Okay,
so
it wasn't.
I don't know. I mean, no one. I mean, I think he did it on purpose.
Well, there were demons. I mean, if you're taking heroin.
Yeah, and he was taking heroin when he was like 13. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Dating a 21-year-old when he was 12. I mean, this kid was like, he grew up really fast for sure.
So this is the point that I wanted to make, is that he was already having troubles and issues long before he even met Bryan.
Right. And I think that what's really amazing when you watch Brad Renfro's performance in Apt Pupil is just how really good it is.
Excellent actor.
And like his ability to hold his own against titanic actors like Ian McKellen and not be intimidated by them at all, and honestly like play just as well with them is, a real testament, I think, to his talent as an actor. And, I think that's one of the reasons Bryan was drawn to him, because obviously, the camera does linger a lot on Renfro's body, and, that obviously Bryan is just in love with this kid's face. The amount of close-ups that Renfro has, especially close-ups with, his mouth half open and kind of looking around, you could just tell that Bryan is just entranced by this boy's face,
Because
he has a great face.
Yeah.
He's a great actor. His face is amazing, and it's definitely the muse of that film. There's no doubt about it. And once again, this is a film with almost no women. It's pretty much all about the relationships between men and boys. Honestly,
well, you said almost no women. Let's talk about the scene where Brad Renfro. They even bring it up later on in the film as sort of tongue in cheek. It's just like, well, what were you doing when you were in high school? It's like, oh, I was chasing girls. Mm-hmm. I was going to the movies like any normal kid. It's like, what's this teenager doing with this creepy old man? Yeah. Oh, he's reading to him. He's taking care of him. What does that even mean?
Yeah, the whole relationship between McKellen and Renfro in the film is fraught with parallels to Bryan's own boyfriend and his own proclivities in life. And there's a scene in Apt Pupil where Ian McKellen basically takes home Elias Koteas, the actor, who's a gay homeless person, and they have this very homoerotically charged conversation over a dinner table before Ian McKellen stabs him in the back with a giant phallic knife and throws him down the stairs of his basement. Then Brad Renfro comes over and eventually kills Elias Koteas. And the whole thing is Elias Koteas is I seen you and the boy. I've seen you guys, I live over here. And like there's this whole undercurrent in Apt Pupil that I find fascinating about boys being with men and using that information and just those and using just that idea to completely get people to do what you want. And this is not better illustrated than the ending of Apt Pupil, which is just so prophetic. I mean, it's honestly gives me chills every time I watch it, in which David Schwimmer goes up to Brad Renfro's house. David Schwimmer plays like the guidance counselor of the school. And he's basically like, hey, you did this, you did that, like you cheated to get good grades and you knew that this guy was a Nazi and you didn't tell me and this and that. And Brad Renfro basically suggests that if you fuck up my life and I don't get into college for this, I'm going to tell everybody that you assaulted me sexually.
And it's kind of almost like putting the cart before the horse. You're watching this film now through the lens, again, being aware of the accusations and Bryan's own defenses. You kind of watch it and it's like, well, this is 1998. This is not common knowledge. This wasn't... Bryan was still like an up-and-coming mainstream filmmaker. Mm-hmm. Was he planning ahead?
Yeah, that's what I think is so amazing about it, is that Ian McKellen also has like this great quote where he's basically talking to Brad Renfro about how this kind of scandal, dragging his name through the mud, it affects everybody, even those who accuse you of it. And he says, the name that's always going to be on my lips whenever anyone asks me about this scandal is your name. If you're the one who puts this out, all I'm going to say is your name. And it's really eerie, like you said, 1998. This is before any of the allegations against Bryan, like from Underage Men. And he's already making an entire film about boys' relationships with men and how the boys essentially become those men at the end of the film. Ian McKellen dies, spoiler alert, and Brad Renfro uses the argument of this scandal will never go away to get what he wants from David Schwimmer at the end after Ian McKellen used it on him earlier in the movie. So there's just so many fascinating threads, I think, in Apt Pupil. Not that it's like I wouldn't say it's like a good movie.
There's some fun, compelling ideas in it.
Yeah, there's some good ideas in it, and it's Bryan Singer in his prime, so it's still really well done. But just in terms of, it's more interesting to me as like the next step in Bryan's evolution as like a filmmaker and a person. Where he's really starting to meld his own filmmaking with like his life,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, why don't we talk a little bit? Around this time, Bryan was making some new friends and had some interesting associates.
Yeah. So there are a couple stories revolving around Apt Pupil and a couple allegations revolving around Apt Pupil that we need to talk about, just because, we can't not. So I'm not going to quote from all this, but this is from The Atlantic. And The Atlantic is going to be, this article came out in 2018, and it's basically the one that destroyed Bryan. There's so many accusations in here. It came out in The Atlantic after Esquire passed on it because there weren't enough sources. So The Atlantic decided to run it instead. So I don't know if that tells you anything. So the first allegation we have did not come out during the shooting of Apt Pupil, but it takes place during the shoot of Apt Pupil. That's a guy by the name of Victor Valdivinos. So he was an athlete, a basketball athlete who went to the school where they were shooting Apt Pupil.
Where did they film Apt Pupil?
It's like in the burbs. It's like the burbs of LA. It's like a nice area. He said, this guy, Victor, he was a student there, and they were filming the basketball scene and the scene in the locker room. And he was like a student there, and he went to go to a urinal, and Bryan Singer came up behind him. Apparently, this is what he said. And he said, Bryan Singer said, "You're so good looking. What are you doing tomorrow? Maybe I could have somebody contact you about putting you in this movie." Singer's attorney has denied all this, but also. Afterwards, Victor, he goes there the next day. He goes to the set in the locker room where it was divided. The locker room was divided into two halves, one where they were shooting and one where everybody could like rest and take a break. And a crew member gave him a towel and told him to take off all of his clothes and only put the towel on. And this is back when Victor was 13. Wow, and so he said that Singer came over to him during setups, and was like, "How are you doing? What are you doing? Do you need anything?" and like he would always be like touching him or touching his chest and like making Victor uncomfortable. And then he said eventually Singer reached through the towel flaps and, quote, grabbed my genitals and started masturbating it. The director also rubbed his front part on me. He did it all with this smile, saying, "You're so good looking. I really want to work with you. I have a nice Ferrari. I'm going to take care of you." Valdivino said that basically during the setups in the locker room, like during the setups, like Bryan would come over there like multiple times throughout the day and do this.
So definitely like very shocking, clear abuse of power.
Right. But Bryan Singer's lawyer also said that there's no record of Valdivino's having been an extra on Apt Pupil, and Valdivino's has no documentation or evidence that he was ever there either. Which I think we've both been extras on productions way smaller than Apt Pupil, and it is pretty impossible to not have any paper trail that you're on a set. I mean, like, maybe if Bryan is as powerful as they say he is, he can sneak people on, but that's really hard to do. Like, to not sign anything and be on a set for a movie that big, it doesn't, I don't know.
Like, anytime you show up on the set as an extra, as a PA, the lowest of the low, you're filling out, 40 pages of documents?
At least, yeah.
You're giving in driver's license information, photo ID, you need to have your timesheet filled out and approved and notarized. So yeah, I mean it's pretty difficult for something, especially a major Hollywood film starring Ian McKellen and Brad Renfro, for information like that to slip through the cracks. Yeah. No pun intended.
Yeah, and so The Atlantic, they just run wild with this allegation. Like, this is one of the allegations in The Atlantic that they really feel is like real, because this guy is on the record. And he basically said, I was a kid and, the Me Too thing happened or this and that. So what happens with all this? What happens with all this shit? It says, Valdivino's here. He filed a complaint to the California Attorney General's office, but it had been passed to the statute of limitations, so there was nothing he could really do. And then he wrote a short summary to apply to the Attorney General's office anyway. And in that summary, he confuses where the molestation took place and when and for how long. He basically gets all of his facts like wrong or backwards. So not saying that, I'm not condemning or doing anything like that, just saying that's what happened. He also said he signed a retainer agreement with an attorney named Jeff Herman. Now, Jeff Herman is going to be a character who's going to be coming up a lot on this show. He pretty much represents every single person who has sued Bryan Singer for rape and has lost every single lawsuit. I don't know how he still keeps getting work, but it's amazing. So him and Jeff Herman, they tried to like file something, but the statute of limitations expired, and there's essentially nothing he can really do. And then Valdivino's claimed, that since the abuse, he's had other failed relationships, and like he served a 1-year jail term for domestic battery, drug possession, and driving a car without the owner's permission. And he's knocked women up and left them, and like, so the guy is like he's like a bad guy.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, it's interesting when you bring that up. The fact is, it's like, is it a chicken or the egg situation?
Exactly.
Because you have someone who, okay, this guy does seem kind of like a shady character, especially coming out after all these years and trying to make these outrageous claims. But it's like, okay, is he making these claims because he is a disreputable individual, or did it really happen and that's what kind of fucked him up for the rest of his life?
Yeah, and The Atlantic, where this is from, are clearly intimating that Bryan's the reason that Victor's life is in shambles, right? So like they said that, with just kind of this really bloodthirsty language, like he was 13 and he hadn't even had his first kiss yet, and I'm just like, just say that they just want all this to be true. They're just a bunch of bloodthirsty monsters. They don't care about Victor. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So there's one more allegation revolving around Apt Pupil that I actually am going to read from a little bit. This is from Entertainment Weekly and published on May 2nd, 1997. So this is pretty much a year before the movie comes out. The titled, Was There an Indecent Proposal Made on Bryan Singer's Apt Pupil Set? So what the story is that there was an extra named Devin St. Albin who filed a lawsuit claiming that the filmmakers ordered him and other minors to strip for a scene that was shot in the showers of the school locker room. Now, the scene itself is actually really good, in which Brad Renfro, shirtless and wet again, is showering and showering and is. There's literally a line that says "hit the showers" in the movie. I don't know. I laughed. So he's showering, and then it turns out like he closes his eyes and opens them, and he's actually in gas chambers with all of these Holocaust survivors. And it's actually a really good scene, very well shot by Singer. So the point is that this guy was 14, and he says that he was told to strip nude. 2 more boys also started supporting St. Albans' claim and entered into the lawsuit. So according to St. Alban, 2 other plaintiffs, one named Ryan and one named David, who were all local athletes recruited by the production, were asked to bring bathrobes to the set. While the parents of the minors sat in the gym, the extras were led into a locker room and instructed to change into sheer peach-colored G-strings provided by the wardrobe department. And St. Alban said that everybody was saying, "What the fuck is that?" People were nervous. That's what he said.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely.
He also said that they were instructed to wear their robes over their G-strings, were ushered past their parents who were like in the hallway and into the shower room set where they were told to take off their bathrobes. Then Assistant Director Fernando Alchuel and Tom DeSanto, who will be coming back up, by the way. This is a guy who works with Bryan for a long time. Tom DeSantos told them to remove their G-strings. St. Albans said that I'm a minor, and they're just like, oh, I guess we can switch you out with this other kid. And so they just switched him out because he wouldn't get naked. So that apparently happened. And then he said another one of the boys tried to shield himself and didn't remove it, but they called cut, and DeSantos came out there and apparently was just yelling at him, telling him to take it off. And he said that he would have felt like a wuss if he hadn't, and that, this was all, he said, like, if they had taken me aside, it would have been one thing, but I didn't like how they, like, just came at me like that, you know what I mean?
They were bullying them.
Yeah, and it says all 3 teenagers are claiming trauma from the experience, charging the filmmakers with, among other things, infliction of emotional distress, negligence, and invasion of privacy. So that article's from 97. Now, The Atlantic sums up what actually happened, where it says, the LA County DA's office declined to press any criminal charges. The suits were settled for an undisclosed sum, and all parties were bound by confidentiality agreements. And then it says, Apt Pupil came out, and the industry's expectations were high, and he went off to do X-Men. But I think what's interesting is that even during Apt Pupil in 97, just 2 years after the Usual Suspects kicks him off, this isn't, like, especially this article from 97, this is some pretty, like, heavy shit to be going on a film set. For sure. Yeah. And, like, given Bryan's proclivities for younger men and the rumors that have come out after this, it's hard to believe that something didn't happen on that set. Whether or not Singer was involved, I don't know, but Tom DeSanto worked with him for many other films.
Yeah, there was definitely something shady going on, whether or not Bryan was directly involved.
Yeah. And this is also going to be a kind of a theme we see about Bryan, is that he's going to always have a somewhat of a proxy or a smokescreen between him and all of these allegations. Like, there's usually one other person involved, or there's people doing things for him in which Bryan is not specifically linked to any of, like, the bad actors that we're really going to talk about. So that's kind of a narrative that's going to keep coming up when we talk about the allegations.
Yeah, so a lot of heavy stuff and a lot of really interesting film talk in upcoming episodes.
Yeah. The upcoming episodes, they're going to be more streamlined than this. This one's a little crazy.
We're just trying to set the tone a little bit.
Yeah. I think that kind of sums up, like, early Singer. That's pretty much, I think that's kind of all. The Valdovinos lawsuit, nothing ever came of that. The Apt Pupil lawsuit was settled out of court. Like, if the LA County DA can't find anything wrong, but they settle out of court, that's weird, man.
Yeah.
And this is the thing, is like when people are trying to cancel Bryan Singer, where are the people canceling all of the lawyers and the studios who probably paid off the DA's office to settle this shit? Where's everyone trying to cancel them? They're not around. Why? Because Bryan Singer's the only one who actually makes good art, you know?
Well, that's the thing. Bryan Singer is the name, a film by Bryan Singer. He's the face of the production. Mm-hmm. Like, he's the one that, at the end of the day, your average guy on the street doesn't know who these lawyers and who these crooked executives are. Mm-hmm. But, like, oh, that's the guy that made X-Men.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what do we have coming up in the next episode?
We're going all in on X-Men. So just be prepared for that.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot to take in, no pun intended. Or pun intended, whatever. Have a good time with it.
Tell me this. Why in Apt Pupil is Brad Renfro, why are there so many scenes of him riding a bike through a tunnel covered in sweat? Like, he's constantly in tunnels.
It's a grimy, muddy tunnel.
Yeah, he's always in tunnels, right? Like, I mean, I don't want to say too much about what we're going to go into the next episode, but Singer referred to Renfro as his boyfriend multiple times, according to, like, multiple sources. So, like, I think, you know, Brad Renfro riding through these tunnels, I mean, North by Northwest level, you know, obvious, like, imagery, I would say. You know, like the train going into the tunnel at the end of North by Northwest, like Renfro going into the tunnel with Bryan. Like, it just seems like, you know, he's telling on himself. He's not, like, that's the thing. It's like, Apt Pupil, he's telling on, it's like Age Ain't Nothing But a Number by R. Kelly. Like, he never lied to us. These people have never lied to us. Their art has always showed us their real truth. You know, that's just my opinion.
And that's what all great art does. So once again, I'm Ryan Bijan.
I'm Connor Quade.
We'll see you next time.